I felt even better when I woke up in the morning. The tiny, dingy hotel room seemed like a small palace, with its ancient tile floors and high ceiling. I somehow felt better, clearer, to know that George was, in fact, my enemy. I wondered if I could survive as an informant, considering the fact that I was very worried that my boss might want me tied up to avoid loose ends. It might not be a horrible idea at all. Besides, the good times were killing me. I felt pretty anxious, and for once, it had little to do with supernatural threats. I was about to spend the day working with someone who wanted me dead in the middle of a room filled with people willing to do it for nothing. The patients were wretches, who were easy to laugh at, but even the most pathetic person alive can pull a trigger. They weren't the only ones with a certain nihilistic strength, though. I wondered why Chris hadn't been exposed to anything weird, even after the close encounter with something trying to kill his friend. I was guessing, at the time, that it was almost certainly the lack of narcotics in his system. Something I had not even yet confirmed, but felt confident of, especially going by his reaction to Grace's use. I was presuming some things I should have asked him about, but I still felt more confident and less insane than I had in months, despite knowing my boss would probably like me to die. The hotel I was staying at was just off of Avernia Street, a massive building for its time. It was built in 1921, with doors that looked almost medieval. Henry Flagler was so smitten with Villa Zoreda and St. Augustine that a powerful Moorish influence began to pervade much of his favorite architecture, and then, slowly but surely, architecture that he had nothing to do with. South Florida is filled with mission-style architecture, largely because of this lasting influence. Even Flagler's home is strangely Hispanic-looking, considering the Anglo-American origin of its builder. It was abundant in the 1920s hotel, with massive dark brown tiles, stucco and stone everywhere, nearly floor-to-ceiling windows, creaking floors, and very little electrical lighting or plumbing. My bathroom was small, and had a clawfoot bathtub and a wash basin that looked like it may have been original. It reminded me of the kind of apartments they have in New York City, especially with its higher view of the semi-urban sprawl. I put myself together and thought about what a nice place to do drugs it was, but decided to keep it slim. I decided to take a good bit less Xanax that morning, coming down to just 2 milligrams. That's still enough to knock a normal human being unconscious, with more ease than Benadryl could muster. But I knew that every minute of the day was going to go by with incredible anxiety that would make every second seem like an hour. The lobby of the hotel was massive, with huge pillars in the corners of the room. Almost everything was a shade of brown, taupe, or beige, giving me the impression that the room was in sepia. The cracking stucco and massive stone floor made it look far more ancient than it was. It was barely lit with small light bulbs here and there, and makeshift fluorescents fixed to the ceiling, which was up to 30 feet in some places. The darkness was thorough, despite the small windows, making it appear as if it were nearly nighttime. If there was a private eye smoking in a button-leather chair, it would look like a tropical noir movie. This was in contrast to the explosion of turquoise and lures of violent pink clouds that loomed outside. Chris and I were planning on meeting at the end of the week, and I had to make a decision fast about whether I would continue working at the pill mill and try to uncover the mystery, or if I should prepare for some truly brutal withdrawals and a proffer from the FBI. This was where the FBI offers one protection from prosecution in exchange for information on one's employers or dealer or whatever. I decided to take a walk from the hotel to the seawall, about 20 minutes each way, despite the fact that the bright turquoise and pink sky indicated it was still early morning. Somehow I felt bold, possibly because of the thought of fucking over George, possibly because I felt more secure knowing that Chris was a potential ally. The area just north of the tightly packed new buildings featuring luxury lofts and obnoxious bars and boutiques, known as City Place, was filled with older buildings. They often had wood floors, and sported either utilitarian box shapes or were grand structures, with nuanced details in every alcove and column. The people were similar enough, either pointlessly wealthy or outrageously poor, and at night, they either panhandled or moved between clubs and stores. I've heard it's gotten a little nicer, but there's still a lot of homelessness. The entire expanded area of downtown West Palm Beach had far more high-rise buildings, and it ran along a stretch of seawall that was always a great place for a walk. I made my way down from the hotel and towards McKebb's, a small bagel restaurant near the well-bubbled Christian University that lurked off of Okeechobee Boulevard. There were plenty of people out that morning. Business people going to work at the many law firms near the massive semi-arch-shaped courthouse that loomed over the district, or just walking their dogs, or begging for change. A kid bumped into me after just about 2 blocks while riding his skateboard. Aside from that, no one interacted with me at all. He didn't turn around or say anything, and from the way people looked at me, I was guessing perhaps I could have shaved or done something better with my hair this morning. I reached the shop and thoroughly enjoyed an egg and salami sandwich to go, on the seawall it was close to. This was a practice enjoyed, in some way or another, by almost everyone living in the area. The waterfront view was amazing, and the architecture of some of the old churches and other older buildings interrupting the skyline once every other block or so made it feel like the modern area had somehow only invaded West Palm Beach. Art Deco, Spanish influences, and high-rise condominiums and offices were wrapped in a light turquoise and pink from the reflections of the sky they offered and framed with the dark green of ubiquitous palm trees. Some people went to the seawall. Some people had views from their desks, and some people just enjoyed the brief drive from Okeechobee that happened to touch the water. But it was hard not to take a relaxing, deep breath in whenever one saw the water. I felt much better, almost like a normal human being. I was walking up a massive artificial hill near an amphitheater about the size of a football field, and I began to even smile and say good morning to passerbys. Some of them even responded in the positive. I was greeting a particularly delighted Lisa Apso, a beautiful young woman in yoga pants, was walking, when I felt a sharp smack on my back. The sound of wheels on the sidewalk pointed me to the kid who had hit me earlier while riding his skateboard, who was catching up with a few friends who had skated ahead. He was wearing a backwards baseball cap with a UM logo on it, and carrying what looked like a bright blue and yellow hat in his hand. He didn't bother apologizing again as he sped up to join his friends, who had found a concrete staircase perfect for mischief. The woman and her dog continued on, obviously weirded out. I turned up Clematis Street, where restaurants, clubs, and boutiques entirely different than the ones that existed the month previously had confidently sprung up, and workers were preparing the outside eating areas for a brunch crowd that wasn't deterred by weekdays. I wondered what it would feel like to go to the gym in the mornings or something. It was feeling like an incredible day, when I suddenly realized I was going to be low on opiates soon, and therefore at risk of God knows what. I reached into my pocket to grope for my stash, when I suddenly felt a shocking pain in my back, and the strange sensation of falling on my face. I hit a small rise in the cement outside a shop hard, and my vision filled with stars. I I could tell from the sharp pain and taste of pennies flooding my mouth that I had bitten down on my tongue. The kid whirled past me, his wheels making a low, almost noxious growl on the sidewalk. This time, he whipped his board around to face me. There was nothing weird about him at all. A small teenager, with a crisp-looking plaid shirt and hipster jeans. He had a mop of brown hair under his cap and light blue eyes. He picked up the board and held it under one arm, while holding what was apparently not a hat, but a bright blue and yellow striped mask in the other. The shape of its face was clearly that of an ibis, or wood stork, and what I thought was a bill previously tapered off into a thin but brightly colored beak. It looked like slick stone, almost as if it had the scintillating appearance of some strange kind of opal. The small group of skateboarders waited on the man-made hill that separated Clematis from the street that ran through City Place. He had a smug grin on his face. I got up as fast as I could, shambling back and into some railing, surprising a waiter. I heard a few of the kids snicker. I walked away from them at an incredible pace, turning 90 degrees right away, and pretending I had somehow not seen them at all. I managed to get back to the safety of the other junkies in the hotel in record time, keeping my head down and not looking behind me whenever I heard wheels on the sidewalk. I didn't see them after I rounded the next block and finally made it to the street with my hotel in view. A pixie-like young girl, with dyed gray-blue hair wearing a bright orange tank top and dark blue and turquoise paisley swimming trunks, sat on a bench opposite the hotel, next to a homeless man who smiled at her happily. She had a large, dark red and seafoam green mask on her lap, and even from that distance, I recognized the fat diamond shape of a gator's head. I stayed indoors for another couple of hours, and called in late. Later, I hurried to my car, and tried not to check if anyone was following me. As I began to wait for another week to end, I hoped to avoid my coworkers' impatience while I read the books on Native American myths Chris gave me obsessively. Debbie was standing behind the desk talking to Aaron when I came in. She turned and smiled to me, but Aaron had a much less happy face as he sank behind his check-in counter. "Good morning! It's great to see you again!" I muttered some kind of greeting, but her saccharine attitude and Aaron's obvious displeasure was making the FBI seem like a great idea already. "Good morning." I smiled weakly and nodded to Aaron quickly to avoid prolonged eye contact. "Could I ask you a question really quick?" Debbie turned and walked back to her office, not bothering to wait for a response. Aaron nodded back to me, but seemed more distracted by a small pull in his bright fuchsia, skin-tight shirt. Or maybe he was looking for an excuse to show his abs to the young girls at the front of the incoming group of patients. I waddled to Debbie's office, hoping this was going to be something not creepy. "Dave wanted to talk to you. When is good for you?" Mondays are inherently fucking terrible. How about later this week? Maybe Friday? If I could bring him to my next meeting with Chris, maybe we could share some insight into whether or not they were trying to kill me again. Sounds great. Also, I hate to ask, but could you help work the desk today? I'm feeling under the weather. This made me quietly furious, as I had planned to hide from the patients and smoke pot whenever possible that day. The lack of Xanax was making me feel deeply stressed. After nodding dutifully, I marched back to the front. Within minutes, patients had filled the disgusting lobby. I was about to get to work filing patients into the computer system when I noticed a young lady who looked like she had been crying much more than usual. Her ringleader was an alpha douche. Short, with a thick Tom Selleck-style mustache, tall black cowboy boots, stained black trucker hat, tight black denim pants, and a camouflage tank top to show off Confederate flags and eagles on wiry-looking arms. He was chewing tobacco and motioned for his friends to stand back before he leaned the upper half of his body over the counter and motioned for me to talk to him. "Bro, I got $50 if you can help me get out of here a little quicker." While it was common to offer money or anything else to get ahead, it was rare for someone to assume that $50 would make me happy to see him. He was about 5'6", but had the confidence of a man who was both taller and less inbred. I nodded, not wanting to say anything, because I hated the man already and didn't want it to become obvious. I moved his file ahead in the doctor's waiting area and tried to put the 2 feminine names in the back so that I could talk to the girl who seemed distraught. She had frumpy brown hair tumbling over a powder blue tank top and blue jeans, and it looked like she had cried the entire ride down. I couldn't see her eyes because she was staring at the ground the whole time, but she wouldn't leave this little creep's side. "Byron James?" I called the little twerp into the second waiting room, where he slipped me a small greasy wad of money that I would bet anything didn't add up to 50. He marched happily into his appointment and left the crying girl in the waiting room, as well as a 6.5-foot muscular skinhead that was apparently named Ashley. The look on my face when he confirmed this must have been priceless, because everyone in the main lobby cracked up when I called him in. I made sure Ashley had his appointment first, leaving the weeping girl sobbing quietly in the corner. I took care of something in the office to give her a couple of minutes before approaching, to make sure at least someone asked her if she was in immediate danger. I made it look like I was inspecting files, when I suddenly noticed that there were no more files left for her group. That could mean that she was just a tag-along, but I wasn't feeling great about my odds. Thoroughly creeped out, I backed away. As I moved away from the files and the girl, I noticed that she was no longer crying, and I felt confident that if I turned around, I would see her staring at me. I turned to go back to the office, but heard her first move and then get out of the chair at a cautious pace. When I reached the office door, I could see her standing, out of my peripheral vision, facing me, away from the doctor's doors in the hallway. I was starting to get a little creeped out, so I decided not to ask her any questions and shut the door behind me. I sat at my desk until I noticed them leaving 10 minutes later. "Thanks for the help, bro." Byron James was clearly thrilled as he held up his prescriptions and threw me a peace sign before handing it over to Aaron to be filled. His crew shuffled out behind him, one at a time. I couldn't help but watch them. After Ashley lumbered out of the door, I still expected the girl to file behind them. The spring attached to the door quietly, but promptly moved it shut after Ashley passed. Aaron got up and walked through the second waiting room to get to the counter where the doctors placed bottles of medication and their completed paperwork. The second waiting room was empty, too. Byron got his medication quickly and began chatting up a pretty blonde while he waited for his lackeys to get their medications and sort out their agreed trades with other junkies in the parking lot and bathroom line. I went back to work in earnest, scanning files and trying not to notice how many had their records shipped to this and that place because the Narcan didn't come soon enough. "Psst, hey, bro." I could hear the sleaze dripping from his voice. Without turning around, I knew Byron was leaning over the counter again, taking advantage of Aaron's brief absence to be even more of a douche than necessary. The problem with taking money from junkies was that they assumed that either you were cool or that you needed money enough to get favors from. Either invited further conversation. I got some good friends and shit, and I was thinking, maybe you could, help them get through faster. I love coming here and all, but these lines, you know. He paused his bullshit to gauge my reaction, and to take a long sip from a tall boy of chilada, a surprisingly refreshing mix of clamato, beer, spices, and lime juice. As I turned from my desk, I saw the girl again. She was sitting in the lobby now, directly next to the pretty blonde Byron had been attempting to fraternize with. Sheila May Cassidy was her name, according to her file. The girl was staring at Sheila with a wide-eyed expression of shock and rage. Her cheeks were still wet, and her pale, oval-shaped face was starkly beautiful, framed by tangles of brown hair that looked incredibly frizzy, and as if they hadn't seen a brush in years. Her weeping made her blue-green eyes look particularly vivid. From the angle she was sitting, I noticed that she had a dark red wet stain on her crotch. Yeah, sure, whatever. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I turned away from Byron, who looked triumphant, despite my failing to meet his high five. I had almost talked to her. No one else seemed to notice her, except for a fat old biker who had put down his Mountain Dew and was now moving cautiously towards the door. I sank down into a brown folding metal chair and lit up a joint, despite being barely obscured. Later on that day, I would get a call asking for Sheila's file and any information about her. It was PBSO this time, not a distant sheriff. Some officers came by to ask us about her too, but were tight-lipped about why. According to the news, they found the lower half of her body outside of La Quinta. I found a couple of tiny tufts of blonde hair in the waiting rooms and outside the next day. I didn't want to take any more Xanax, so I decided to drink some NyQuil just to be on the safe side. I got away from my desk, went to the back door that met the alley behind our Junketarium, and told Aaron that I needed a quick break for a joint, prompting him to nod and put out his cigarette. After smoking a couple of joints and drinking a little more NyQuil, I staggered out of my folding metal chair. I wanted to simply feel nothing. I went into Debbie's office to see if maybe she had some shrooms or something, but her office was empty. The door to the second waiting room was closed, and I noticed her car keys were missing, so I assumed she had run out. Her office had a single small fluorescent light that she ignored in favor of a tidy-looking desk lamp. It was the only thing tidy about the office. With papers everywhere and the walls covered in stupid posters and framed pictures of her and her friends. After rummaging around her desk for a few minutes, I found a few shrooms, a small bag of pills, some coke, and a lot of half-finished paperwork. Since I was already shamelessly rifling through her shit on the pretense of being in the back for an innocent narco break, I decided to look through it. Behind some unfinished attempts at lying to the DEA about diversion practices, there were some pictures that she had developed. They were from work and her house, and seemed to be from the same group as the ones on the wall. I even saw one of me looking wasted at her house. That was when I noticed the one of her drinking a beer at the Gold Ring pub with a friend. Her friend was a young man, wearing a blue t-shirt and smiling awkwardly into the camera, as Debbie flaunted her massive Silicon Valley in a black tank top. The young man was the same man who I saw dressed nicely with a bolo tie asking for help. In some of the pictures, he was helping out with paperwork at American Injury Clinic, the behemoth narco factory that was George's flagship. I wondered if I had been his replacement. For the first time in years, withdrawal seemed like a better option than counting the many, seemingly intertwined risks. When I got to my desk, I began to Google news investigations, to see if I could find the names of the prosecutors or agents specifically involved. I went back to work a lazy half-hour later, longer than usual, but not enough to raise eyebrows. Debbie came back an hour later, with slightly darker skin than she left with, and a frappuccino. I felt a twinge of disgust when she smiled at me, and the blunt trauma of betrayal made it difficult to focus on anything else. I began to scan files again, now keeping an eye out for names. Anything that seemed familiar, I tried to file away. The lack of Xanax was helping quite a bit. I wondered what a proffer from the FBI would actually look like. "Wilks, could I talk to you for a second?" Jessica's voice came from her medication room, directed in no particular direction. I happily shambled back to the only consistently clean room in the clinic. "Grace and I were talking, and she mentioned that she never heard from you." She trailed off, expecting an answer, but I didn't have one. After calling the first number, Chris's, I was happily under the impression that Grace was something to avoid. When did you talk to her?" The pit was already forming in my stomach before I had begun to ask the question. I quickly hoped that she had called her, and that there was a strange story behind it to confirm that something had happened to Grace. "We went out shopping the other day. She works at the Neiman Marcus on the island and gets a killer discount. I guess she hasn't heard from Chris in a while. Did you manage to get a hold of him?" I shook my head, not knowing what to say. I felt like the room was suddenly 30 degrees colder. No. I will call Grace, though. Some stuff happened. I need some time to chew on things." Jessica looked dead serious and nodded at the ground, seemingly genuinely sympathetic. "You look like you've lost weight and cleaned up a bit lately." "Thanks." I had actually gained weight. I'm a stress eater, and wasn't taking the lack of Xanax and opiates well, although my bowel movements were a lot better. I was wearing clean clothes and didn't smell, so I took it as a genuine compliment. I awkwardly shuffled away from the beautiful girl. I wondered why whatever Chris was would give me books and talk to me, instead of eating or killing me. I wondered what relation he had to the other things I had seen. I wondered if maybe Jessica had gone shopping with a still-moving corpse of something that used to be Grace. I couldn't think clearly enough to even imagine a scenario that might tie it all together. The next day, I wasn't taking the decrease in Xanax and the creepy kids outside my hotel very well. I hadn't seen them again, but I also hadn't ventured outside during the night or morning and kept the blinds shut. Sure enough, by the time the next morning started in earnest, I felt as if I had 4 cups of coffee and was ready to scream every time anyone made even the slightest traffic error. When I got to the clinic, the parking lot was half filled with beaten down vehicles that were packed like clown cars filled with junk aficionados. Many with towels or blankets over the windows to keep light out while the occupants slept. Some of them stood in circles, forming small narcotic stock markets, as middle dealers debated how many of which pills would be the best to trade off with others. Many people would get killed over deals made in that parking lot. Entire fortunes came and went every day, usually in cars worth less than $3,000. The strip mall with the pill mill faced another strip mall on the other side of the parking lot, which looked like a flea market for narcotics. I tried not to pay attention to their stares as they whispered angry speculations as to when they could expect to finally get in and get their medications. Before I made it to the door, I suddenly recognized an increase in volume from the back of the lot, and finally, the telltale yelp of Hicks shouting. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and ran towards it, texting Debbie to send Aaron out as I went. When I got to the noise, I saw a ring of filthy human backs, with heads pointed towards whatever was in the center of that ring. If they were fighting, especially over drugs, a lot of people could easily be going to jail if the cops had to come break it up. The wall of backs was too densely packed to see around. "Come the fuck on, people!" I yelled, hoping that someone would want medication badly enough to have some interest in helping get the two combatants apart. They ignored me, other than a few frightened faces turning to glance at me before focusing again on whatever was in the center of the circle. They did this while backing away. I could hear a gurgling and cracking noise over the frightened yelps and calls to relatives nearby. I pushed my way between an obese biker with a Confederate and American flag on his black leather vest and a skinny man with thin black hair who looked like he had more junk than food lately. The skinny man looked horrified and was shaking violently. He recognized me and pointed to the center of the action before backing away with frightened babble. There, in the center of the human filth, I saw him. An old, tall, and very fat man. His face turned away from me, struggled to get up with the help of his cane. His bright yellow long-sleeve shirt and khakis were covered in blood. I looked around and couldn't see anyone near him, much less an obvious assailant. I saw Aaron picking up the pace from a slow jog to a quick sprint toward us, so I cautiously broke through the ring wall. "All right, everyone, calm down. We're going to get this man medical attention. Sir, do you need help walking?" I asked as calmly as I could and hoped he didn't. That looked like a lot of blood. I heard a strange gurgle and more cracking, and the people facing the man as he finally got to his feet cringed and backed away. When he turned around, I could see why. He was a fat old man named Ted, who was the ringleader for a particularly scummy group. He regularly tried to get as many young girls possible hooked and turning tricks. Red gore dripped down from his chin, and everything around his mouth was smeared with red. Gleaming white shards poked from between the red flow of blood from his mouth. He appeared to be grinding his teeth, using every ounce of force the muscles in his jaw could allow to force what was left of his mouth to grind together, shattering and uprooting several teeth in the process. He stared at me with a glazed-over, peaceful look.
"Please help me."
Each word came with a small spray of blood and shattered teeth fragments. Veins bulged on the sides of his head, but he had a calm, almost serene look in his eyes. He swung his cane forward and began to walk towards me, with his hand outstretched for help. What was left in his mouth was so broken down, it resembled shattered bits of porcelain draped in his own gore. He lurched towards me to take my hand, while I slowly walked to him. Before I felt two strong arms on my shoulders yanking me back. "Let's go!" Aaron shouted directly into my ear, and practically threw me in the other direction. I walked, slowly at first, towards the clinic door until Aaron gave me another shove and jogged past me. I saw the junkies shamble quickly to their cars or the front doors of the clinic. I heard a deep gurgle some yards behind me and picked up the pace when a scream rang out. The skinny man with the black hair had been cornered by the fat bleeding man after he ran into an alcove in the strip mall across the way. He didn't realize it was a dead end with a small concrete block corner that was frequently used by junkies for sleeping, shooting up, and turning tricks. When I reached the strip mall columns, I saw him in the tinted reflection. He had tried to move around the fat man, who fell down in an attempt to grab him. I could see the front of the skinny man's shirt was covered in blood from the fat man spraying. I ran inside the clinic and tried to act normal behind the desk. As I got to the door, I forced myself not to turn my head to see a kid with something brightly colored in their hands, standing at the end of the strip mall walkway, staring at me. An hour or so later, when the police one of our neighbors called finally showed up, they found the fat man crumbled in the unwindowed cement corner. I saw them dragging a bag out, but we heard later on the police were asking people if anyone hit him, because apparently most of the bones in his body had been broken. The tall, skinny man never got to the front door, but someone he was with was asking if anyone knew where he'd gone to. Apparently, he told them happily not to worry about him, and strolled right out of the parking lot, instead of getting his meds and going back to Kentucky where his family was waiting. The next day, I almost felt like praying for peace and quiet. The small hotel room was beginning to feel less unique and cool, and more threatening, and I checked every kid with a skateboard to see if they had a mask as well. I waited until there wasn't a hint of the nuclear colors of dawn that cover Florida, and began to get ready in a small ancient bathroom, where I shaved using a razor I'd bought at Publix, instead of my shitty old electric for the first time in years. I wasn't used to the sight of my face without stubble left over. I drove quickly to the clinic, wanting to get the day over with. In the clinic, someone had put Stranger Than Fiction on, instead of the action movies the patients typically enjoyed, and some deeply sad song was playing while Will Ferrell had a pensive, frustrated look on his face. I walked into the front office and saw Debbie waiting for me, in front of the door where the second waiting room linked the front office to everywhere else. Dave wanted to know if he could meet you tonight instead of later. Debbie confronted me out of the blue, before I was even able to sit down, speaking matter-of-factly. I kind of have something. It's actually really important. Could we do it tomorrow? I needed at least a little while to chew on things. He actually needs to see you tonight. She smiled pleasantly and spoke in a soft but slightly happy voice. I wondered if it was just another meeting, which wouldn't be atypical, or if I was about to die. Or maybe Chris would kill me before I even got there. I nodded and sat down at my desk without a word. She went to chat with Aaron about some guy who hit on her while she was on a gambling boat with George. Patients began to pour in when Aaron finally flipped the lock and I was safely filing useless paper. It occurred to me that it might be possible to discreetly contact authorities and maybe get some help. I remembered the name of the detective who I had read were investigating a pill mill they managed to close down south. After an hour or so, I googled the name on my phone and brought up a number. While sitting on the toilet, pretending to be horrifically constipated due to opiates like normal, I texted a Detective Juan Roa that I was working for George and needed to talk to him discreetly. I got a text back asking what time and place I would feel comfortable with, and responded that tonight would be great, and that I would get back to him on the location. He agreed, and I flushed the empty toilet. Before I could reach the doorknob, my phone rang. It was Chris. I stared at it, disbelieving. It continued to ring, and I muted it and sat back down on the closed toilet seat. It went to the voicemail and instantly began to ring again. This was clearly happening one way or the other. Hello? Tell them to meet you at Bryant Park after sundown. Chris's sharp voice cut me off before I could even finish the word hello. It was followed by the screen on my phone telling me the call had ended. I stood up, my knees shaking, and almost instantly fell down. I got back up, feeling weak and nauseous, a combination of a lack of drugs and too much supernatural shit was getting to me. After finally getting up, I threw cold water in my face repeatedly and texted Dave that I was going to be at Bryant Park, where I decided to lie and say I was staying near, after dark. He asked if I could do it earlier, and I told him I'd promised my mother something. He agreed. I went back to the office, moving slowly and carefully. My shoulder and back ached horribly, after 2 bad falls in a short period of time. In the front office, Aaron and Debbie stopped talking when I entered the room and looked at each other. Aaron smirked a little, while Debbie looked depressed, staring down at the floor and leaving the room instead of making eye contact with me. At the end of the day, I felt weak from having been sitting terrified all day, wondering what was going to happen to me. I took a long look at the clinic before heading out to the park to wait for sunset. I sat near an outdoor auditorium that bordered a small dock. There were rows of old rotted wood, making benches for the crappy reggae bands that sometimes played on the weekends. More normally, the homeless used the covered stage as a home for a particularly large group that congregated there during the nights. As the boats began to pull into the docks to be towed away by SUVs and trucks, the hobos began to appear, cautious at first, as if worried the sight of people with money might bring some kind of threat. Slowly but surely, a small group of 7 began to move to the auditorium, with most lying on the ground and 2 men watching the seawall and coast carefully, as if waiting to see something. After some time, a pair of headlights and a deep burble alerted me to a Dodge Challenger, a dark purple car I had seen Dave drive at least once before. He pulled into the small parking lot, looked at the homeless, and motioned for me to come to him. I began walking to him and felt one of my legs shake a little, but he had a pleasant and relaxed smile on his face. He was wearing a light green shirt and dark sunglasses, with orange plaid shorts. As I got closer, 2 massive men got out of the car. One wore a lavender-colored shirt, with dark black letters spelling the name of some brand. The other just wore a white tank top and black denim shorts, assumedly to show as many tattoos as possible. Both were covered in tattoos, many, such as the 88 on the forehead of one, and the letters HH and Shamrock on the neck of the other, would let anyone aware of the crime world know that they were ranking members of the Aryan Brotherhood. "Let me see your cell phone real quick." I thank God that I had already deleted all my previous texts and calls, other than to him and one to my mother. I handed him the phone and he removed the battery and handed it to one of his associates, who put it in the trunk of the car. It began to occur to me that even with 2 possible sources of backup, or new problems on the way, a gunshot to the head would only take a second that I probably didn't have. Dave motioned for me to walk with him, and we began to walk away from the amphitheater parking lot, into a large concrete outcropping that jutted from the park on the other side of the dock. It was a small, cross-shaped fishing pier, with 2 side abutments that were often used by the elderly to enjoy the view of the water. Right before the top of this cross, after the 4 sections met, was a pavilion that used to be used as housing by the homeless. But tonight, the entire area and the shuffleboard court in front of it was empty. Dave and the men were completely silent as we walked towards what felt an awful lot like my doom. "So, how is everything going at American?" I tried to make small talk, but my voice cracked as we got to the shuffleboard courts in front of the pier. "Relax. We'll talk in a second." He had a friendly ring in his voice, but there was curtness behind it that confirmed my suspicions. We walked past the shuffleboards, with the 2 men suddenly much closer behind me and on either side. I knew I had no way to run. We turned the corner, And in front of the pavilion, where the homeless used to sleep, between two badly dimmed lights, Chris sat on the ground, watching us. He wore a white shirt with white pants, but I couldn't see the details in the dark. Something dark spread around his neck and the front of his shirt. A pair of shoes were just off to his right. What I could see was the brightly colored mask in his hands. He slowly moved the mask to his face, where it stayed, seemingly without anything to hang over his ears or the back of his head to keep it there. What looked like a pile of smeared gore sat on top of the pavilion, hanging just slightly in view from behind a roof turret. He stood up in a single fluid movement. I felt a hand on my shoulder for one of the men, stopping me from moving back. Chris began to walk, slowly but confidently, towards us, in what appeared to be a beautiful, translucent, light green mask that seemed to be some kind of bird. I could still see the features of his face through it, but I noticed he looked absurdly slender after he stood up. His clothing hung off of him like a sail. He was walking towards us steadily, his bare feet not moving slower or faster than a casual walk. "Hey, we're gonna need you to head out, buddy. Sorry, but we're gonna need the area." Dave said this quickly and turned around to face me and his friends. He scowled angrily. I doubted he liked being seen with me at the time, but before he could turn around to say something else, he noticed the odd look on his friend's face as Chris moved closer. "Let's just go to the other pier," the skinhead in the tank top growled to Dave. "Shit. Yeah." The other skinhead sounded disappointed. Dave looked at me with deep consideration. The fuck is he doing anyways? Dave turned around to see what the two were staring at, only to see Chris within about 10 yards. The thing that looked like a mask seemed to be melting into his skin. I could hear a faint ripping sound coming from him. At first, I thought it was from his mask, but then he doubled over, involuntarily, and it became clear that Chris's entire body was making horrible cracking and gurgling noises. Blood poured down his neck as the edges of the mask seemed to eat into his skin. All at once, 100 small changes seemed to work together, starting and finishing in slightly more than a blink of an eye. His jet black skin was becoming mottled, like a plucked chicken, but stayed its dark hue. Tears in his skin were visible here and there as it stretched to cover what seemed like much longer arms, showing bones and viscera. The mouth of the mask seemed to invade his own, the beak suddenly moving, first crudely like an animatronic. His eyes were still visible, but the skin around them was stretched and moving. They were larger than they should have been, massive orbs that seemed to move slightly away from each other. His knees snapped and popped with a horrific sound, bending backwards. The flesh underneath his mask where his nose had been emitted a sickening wet crack. The beak began to move more gracefully. The three men were stunned, with the skinhead in the lavender shirt staring slack-jawed until Chris's beak opened wide at us, revealing a long, rotted tongue before shrieking. It sounded like metal tearing into metal, or a fax machine gone horribly wrong. He began to move faster, walking more like a stork, and I could see that his fingers had giant black hooks at their ends. Taking advantage of the lack of a hand on my shoulder, I jumped to the side, into a small buildup of sand on the fake peninsula. "Fuck!" Dave screamed, taking a small, silenced 9mm from a discreet holster on his side and taking aim. An angry snapping sound came from the gun, but what was once Chris leapt at Dave with an enraged chortling sound. before his friends could take out their firearms. Its legs flung the thing at Dave at an incredible speed, and all I saw was a bright blur and a sickening, solid-sounding smack as both Dave and Chris hit the ground, right where I had been standing, between his friends. Before getting up and running, I saw Dave's two friends bring out their weapons a second after the long beak that was once a mask landed on and poked through Dave's chest as easily as a syringe through the arm. It crouched over him, tearing its beak out of Dave's chest a split second after landing and bringing a spray of red gore with it. As Dave's friends attempted to save their own lives, I heard a loud bang, or rather, felt it. Two blinding flashes of light came from the scene and I looked away. Suddenly I could only hear ringing and my ears hurt like hell. I got up after what felt like an eternity and began to run like hell away from the scene and towards the streetlights of the main road that seemed so far away. A splash of some warm liquid landed on my back and I decided I didn't need to know what it was. I ran as fast as a fat man possibly can run. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move insanely fast towards the fight, and prayed whatever it was would delay any surviving skinheads, or Chris. My whole torso hurt, but my lungs fought to suck air in and burned worse than any bong hit. I managed to get past the shuffle court and into the parking lot lights in front of the boat ramp, but couldn't see a soul there. I couldn't hear anything other than ringing, but a single bright flash of light behind me let me know it wasn't safe to slow down. I pushed myself as hard as I could, and I began to run past the auditorium, thinking the homeless were probably going to do anything they could not to get involved. As I reached the edge of the auditorium, I suddenly hit a hole in the ground and fell. My mouth filled with warm, viscous blood, and I let it simply fall out of my mouth, rather than truly spitting. From the parking lot lights, I saw something make a silhouette on the ground, coming from behind me, and I struggled to do a push-up for the first time in years to get off the ground and start moving again. Before I could even get all the way up, two pairs of bright lights pulled up with an angry roar from a side street connected to the park, and I saw someone get out of the car and point a gun at me. I put my hands up, on my knees. My brain couldn't even process what I thought was going to be my death. Instead, there was nothing. I just waited, with two headlights and then a flashlight aimed directly at me. The man with a gun was a police officer. Help! I could not hear my voice, but I felt the word falling out of my mouth, along with more blood. Later on, I would find out the sound of gunshots had brought an officer who was just getting home from his shift to drive over someone's front lawn and through the wrong way of an alley to get to the sound within seconds. From the blood pouring out of my mouth, he assumed I had something to do with it and called backup. Detective Juan Roa managed to get there for our appointment just a few minutes later. A tall, dark-haired man with pale olive skin and a youthful mustache who wore a PBSO white polo with dark green pants. He had a surprisingly uncop-like voice. He was so delighted to hear that I wanted to wear a wire and have constant police surveillance that they completely forgot to do the whole bad cop routine. They brought me to the station, got a doctor to come to us and check me out, ordering some medianoche sandwiches, when the doctor told them I had only broken 2 teeth on one side and could still eat if I avoided it. I told an officer what I normally text like with George and Debbie, and he told them that Dave and company never made it to the drop. They were both horrified, but the police can't just arrest someone without anyone finding out, and they only found a few strings of gore, a bit of bone, and some shell casings where the fight happened. so they were eventually just filed as missing, since I declined to mention the stuff about a bird demon. They assumed a fight had broken out among them, since I told them I had seen Dave raise a gun to his friend and ran away instead of walking over. The next week felt great. My employer suspected a robbery, since Dave and them were apparently caring enough to make it worthwhile. They asked me plenty of questions and at times seemed worried, but eventually decided a witch hunt for whoever had robbed them was in order. Debbie and George never really did figure out why I was suddenly less wasted, more focused, and always willing to chat about business until it was too late. I went out in the morning again, a couple of weeks, after I had a doctor give me enough benzos to sleep through the opiate withdrawals. My tolerance was pretty weak by then. There weren't any kids standing guard by my hotel, but I saw the kid with brown hair need the Publix that separated City Place from Clematis after a short walk. He stared at me inquisitively, but after a few moments seemed to lose interest. He and his friends began to move in a pod towards the Dreyfus School of the Arts, a selective high school. After that, I started taking morning walks. Slowly, but then more regularly. Plenty of weird shit happened in the clinic, and I usually just kept my head down. But nothing ever bothered me directly again. At least, none of those bird things did. I decided to never call Chris again, but I did contact Grace, who will use this account with Jessica later. Some legal changes have occurred in Florida, and at the time I'm writing this, there is a significant chance the pill mills may return, in full force. They seem to think a lot of the horrible shit that became common back then might be coming back.